My name is Robert Munteanu, and because I am so bad at giving concise titles, this is Escape the Defaults, Configuring Sling to Behave Like AEM as a Cloud Service. Whew, a mouthful. Now, to kick off a bit about myself, I work for Adobe in Basel, Switzerland, although I originally come from Romania. I work on the core of AEM as a cloud service, and in the open source world, I contribute a lot to Apache Sling, Jackrabbit, and Felix. Now, this talk today is going to start with a very important question. So why change the defaults? I think it's the same thing to ask ourselves. And we're going to get through a set of defaults. We're going to talk about separation of content and apps, something we've heard quite a bit about before, principle-based authentication, system user pre-authentication, and the OSGI installer. We're going to wrap them all up with a hopefully nice demo in the end, and then some resources. For some reason, I still don't understand why I was inspired to take some metaphors from Greek mythology for this talk. So one interesting guy that I found out about is someone called Procrustes. So this guy had a bed, and that's not a bad thing by itself, but he had the idea that everyone must have fit precisely in his bed. If your legs were too long, he would cut them off. If you were too short, he would stretch you until you would fit the bed perfectly. Now, obviously, that's not the winning solution if you're building frameworks, right? So Sling doesn't do that. Sling is way more flexible. It doesn't tell you how to deploy your configurations, how to write your code, which scripting language to use. Persistence mechanism, or notably, doesn't tell you to separate content and apps, or content and code. But Sling gives you all sorts of tools. One of them, and one which you know very well, is CRXD Lite. And CRXD Lite is very much a development tool. You can ask various questions of it, such as what access control entries are defined for this node, or what is the content structure of the repository. But you should not use it for so-called operation styles of questions, right? What revision of the code am I running? Do I have some local changes on the code? Do I have the same code version on all instances? And please never ask it, how can I deploy a quick fix in production? But again, Sling doesn't stop you from doing that. Still, there are better ways of asking these questions. But if you're using Kubernetes, I'm not saying you necessarily should, right? If you're using containers and Kubernetes, right, kube control will tell you, hey, this is the image and this is the version you're running. And that's a nice way of asking. If you're using operating system packages, right, you can query the operating system database and say, hey, this is the version I'm running. Yeah, and by the way, this is how you'd update it. You could even ask the question using some sort of REST or HTTP API. I'm not a huge fan of this, first of all, because I think versions should be declarative and stored as attributes, not created at runtime, and because things can go wrong. But it's better than asking CRXD Lite. Sling, as I said, doesn't prevent you from changing code at runtime, but it can be configured to. You can configure to have read-only libs and apps, so you can make sure that some change does not sneak in at runtime. And that is achieved through the separation of content and apps. I will not go too heavily into this because we've talked about it a lot, but it's basically achieved through the Composite node store. The Composite node store basically allows you to expose one single node store, to expose multiple individual node stores as a single one. And the typical setup and what you will see in AEM as a cloud service is that there is a mount that holds all the code and configuration, and that is read-only, and one that holds the rest, which we can call content. And what makes this setup interesting is that you can stop Sling, swap out the libs mount with one that is already prepared, and restarted it. So it allows this kind of rapid switch that doesn't expose you to, okay, let's deploy bundles at runtime, let's take care that we preserve the same content, etc. So we say, okay, that's a good idea. Let's do this. And the first step to having a libs and apps to swap is to generate it. And that turns out it's a pretty interesting problem. Now, obviously, libs and apps have to be presented under the form of a node store. And they must reflect the state of the deployment as represented by nodes, principles, indexes, access control entries. And they can be coming from various sources, repo init, content packages, Sling content loader, and even Java code like bundle activators, install hooks, various components at runtime, which is a pretty complicated thing to do if you sit down and think about all the things which you need to take into account. So this brings me to my next metaphor. Now, the Greek gods weren't particularly kind, so they punished this one king for various reasons. It was called Sisyphus, and he had to push a boulder up the hill for eternity. As soon as he pushed it to the top, it will roll back down again, and he had to go again and again and again. And no, that is a bit of how I'm convincing Sling to generate libs and apps. So I have a very nice setup here that starts Sling, waits for it to be ready using the Felix system ready checks, and then stops it. Start up Sling for no good reason except for the fact that it's the easiest way to generate that libs and apps repository. And then we save the repository, we put it aside to be used. Principle-based, so that was separating content and apps and how we achieved that as a matter of principle. Now, principle-based authentication might sound a bit scary whenever we're talking about authentication principles. What are principles? Let's take a step back and talk about resource-based authentication, or basically authentication as we know it in Jackrabbit. Now, resource-based authentication means that you have a target resource, right? In our case, it's /content. And then that resource has a rep policy child node. And then that rep policy child node has multiple child nodes itself that represent grant or deny access control entries. In our case, this says allow everyone read to /content. And it's called resource-based because the access control entries are stored with the resources. Now, not surprisingly, principle-based authentication means that the access control entries are stored with the principles, that is, with the users. So right now, we are looking at principles under home users system Sling. And this, I'm not going to try to pronounce, right? This YV8 something unpronounceable node name is actually Sling scripting, but because of the generation policy of Oak principal names is encoded like that. And then it has a rep principal policy entry, and then a number of child nodes that describe the actual policies that are applied to it. So it says, the principal entry says, allow Sling scripting read access to the repository root. Okay, that being put aside, why would we use principle-based authentication? Now, first point is that it is easy to inspect them for a given principle. You just go to the repository and look at the child entries for that principle. You do not have to look all around the repository or use a specialized tool. You just have them there. Another interesting part is that you can define access control entries for various nodes, even though they don't exist. It's always a bit interesting to define access control entries in vault content packages and split them, because you would have a content package with the content that refers to principles that are defined in a different package. Now you can just have all the authentication, like the principles and the access control entries packaged in a single place, and it's independent of the content. And that solves some interesting problems. Okay, so how do we use them? From the repository point of view, there are some node types that you can use. So the principal entry, the policy, the mix-ins, or you can use your favorite repository tool to create these principles and the entries. From a repo init point of view, it's also quite easy. There are a couple of statements, and compared to the original set ACL, we now have a set principal ACL, and that by default will create principal ACLs. There are a couple of Oak components that need to be configured. These are already configured in the Sling starter if you'd like to see that. So next up is pre-authenticating system users. Now, why system users? Why pre-authentication? Now, just in case anyone forgot, login administrative is bad. Bad as in the slash your car tires and make your sports team lose kind of bad. It should be used in only very, very specific circumstances. I mean, even if you know that your user will need access to the whole repository, it's good to do a service user mapping, because maybe at some point you would want to restrict the privileges. So to get away from login administrative, we have login service. And the API, obviously, instead of saying login administrative, it says login service. There are two variants. The one that takes two null arguments, and it uses the bundle name implicitly, and another that allows you to pass in a subservice argument. And these, in turn, are mapped to OSGI configurations of the type service user mapper impl. And you can either say the whole Sling, in this case, internationalization bundle, is mapped to the Sling I18 user. Or in this case, for the servlet resolver, the console can subservice mapping can read the whole repository, or the scripts subservice can only access what the Sling scripting user accesses as well. Okay, so what is actually wrong with that? Why do we want to switch to something else? Well, first off, it's the matter of duplicated system user privileges. So let's take, for instance, the Sling mapping user, which needs to read the whole repository to read various mappings. Fine. But then comes the I18 user, which also needs the same kind of read access to the whole repository. Okay, fine, you say, we just map the same service user. For both bundles, we have an abstraction. And then you have something like the JCR installer, which will read the whole repository, but it also needs to write on to do the JCR installer write back under apt Sling install. And suddenly this is where the abstraction breaks. So another Greek mythology time, item time. So it was one of the burial beliefs or the burial rituals of the ancient Greeks that when they would bury someone, they would put a coin alongside, so that they would be ferried across the river Styx by Charon, so the boatsman. So in turn, they did pass on some sort of a token, and they sort of pre-authenticated or pre-authorized the person who just died, so they would be granted access. So this is a bit of what the pre-authenticated login does. It allows us to supply all the known principles at login time. So we can map a collection of principles to a single service user. It doesn't do any other work to authenticate users. It's hence the pre-authenticated name. It doesn't do any other work. And it looks a little bit like this. So assume we have a Sling read-all user that can read on the whole repository, and then the Sling JCR install that can write on app Sling install. The mappings now look slightly different. So the I18 bundle takes an array of users instead of a single one, and that is mapped to the Sling read-all user that can read the whole repository. And that's the same so far. But on the other hand, the JCR installer is mapped to both the Sling JCR install and the Sling read-all user, which means that it effectively gets the privileges for both the read and the write. And that allows us to be a lot more expressive with the permissions of the service users, and also faster. Now, onwards to the final metaphor or comparison. There is also the myth of the giant with the many eyes called Argus, who would be able to see and watch everything. And eventually, as it happened in Greek mythology, he gets killed. And Hera, the goddess, took his many eyes and placed them on the peacock, right? Hence the image of the peacock. And the OSGI installer is, in a sense, like a creature with many eyes. It can watch multiple sources for various artifacts, bundles, configurations, content packages, extensible, and it looks in the file system, in the Launchpad provider, in the JCR repository, and then acts based on the resources that it found. And obviously, it's a dynamic component. It's sort of a reconciler. It takes defined some input sources and transform the application state to be in accordance with those multiple sources. I would say, however, that it is not needed in an immutable or statically defined application. And in the current context, we are indeed building immutable applications. So let's make a little thought experiment and see how we can have Sling with the same feature set, but without using the OSGI installer. Now, this is all in the context of the feature model. And the feature model allows us to declare bundles with start orders. And it's natively using the OSGI APIs. So we have that solved. We have configurations as well. So it's also using the OSGI APIs, and that's good. Content packages, there is an extension for content packages, and you would say, okay, so we're done with content packages as well. But what the extension does is that by default, it creates resources for the OSGI installer. So that's not going to work. Even more, content packages are complex, featureful items, and they implicitly rely on the OSGI installer when they have configurations or bundles placed under certain locations. So that won't work out of the box. So enter the content package to feature model converter, which is a command line tool that takes a content package and converts it to a repo init, to a feature definition that contains nested configurations, bundles, converted content packages if needed, repo init statements, which looks a little something like this, assuming you would take a content package with various embedded resources. It would define a bundle if it needed to. It would define various OSGI configurations that it found the repository, repo init as well, creating service users and access control entries, and eventually embedding other content packages if it found content that would not be converted to a feature file. Note the classifier here, CP2FM converted. And the final piece of the puzzle is a package registry that is an alternative to the regular JCR package registry, which stores packages in the file system. Doesn't need a JCR repository to assemble it. Of course, it needs them to install, and relies on something called an execution plan that is prepared by the Sling content deployment extension. So now that I've raced through all of the topics, it's time to go for a little demo. So this is a feature model definition of Slingshot that has been changed from what is currently in the Sling start in the master branch. And you can see that I've taken away all the embedded bundles, the configurations, the repo in it, and converted them to a couple of content packages. One which is apps, one which is content. This Docker image will use the Composite node store setup. So there are two new run modes. One, the Composite seed, which basically configures this mounting for provider service so that all components, such as the indexes, write them in a way that is going to be used or remounted at runtime. And this piece of code that I'm not terribly proud of, called the instance stopper, which does the Sisyphus work, and it takes a reference to the Felix system ready, waits for 10 seconds because this is a demo, and then stops Sling, right? So that makes sure that more or less Sling is prepared. The run mode is a bit more involved, but the gist of it is that we actually have two node stores, one that is libs and one that is apps. One that is global, that holds the rest of the repository. And this is all wrapped up in a Docker file. This one starts the Sling in the seed mode. Then we have a couple of Oak run commands. We create a structure that the Composite node store expects. And then the command is to, delete the compiled scripts and then start up Sling in the Composite run mode. Let's start up Sling. There is a Docker compose file here with running version 1.0. And it's going to take just a little bit to start. All right, that should be more or less done. Right, so if I go here to Slingshot, no. We get a regular JSP page, and something which I would like to do is change the content on that page. I'm going to do it using Composite. And the reason for changing that page is just to see that the content is preserved between updates. Slingshot info, and I guess this is customary. Hello, adaptTo. Wonderful, good. Now, let's stop Sling and use version 1.1 of the application. As this started, I was not totally happy with the design of the page, so I improved it. Yeah, I guess that's much better. But besides my styling skills, what is interesting to see is that the content has been preserved. And the rollout of the change was quite fast. I would like to briefly, to leave a few room for questions, show you this content package to feature model converter file. This is a command line tool, and I will convert, first of all, the content package, right? So I will tell it where to output the artifacts and where to output the Sling mod, the feature model files, and to convert the slingshot content package. And if I look here, I'm going to see that it generated just a single feature model file which contains the original package. Now, the reason is that it found nothing to convert in terms of applications. Now, it changed the output directory, but this time we convert the applications content package. And this time we have Maven artifacts, we have a feature file, and a new content package. And if we look at the actual output, it's similar to what I showed in the demo. And also interesting to see is that there are no, for instance, the bundle that was extracted is no longer found here, but it made sure to remove all the things which are not which are now part of the feature model. And I guess I should reserve some time to answer the questions. So let me see if I have something in the Q&A pod. Yes, it's true, Muhammad. Everyone loses a limb or an eye. It's the way Greek gods worked. So if there are any questions right now, I'm happy to take them. I guess I can skip to the resources part. Okay, so if there are no questions, we can wrap up early. Thank you for your time. I'll obviously still be around, so feel free to grab me in a chat room or whatever to talk about this. Thank you.